Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I am the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to today's virtual program, The Salem Witch Trials and the Digital Archive, with Dan Lipkin and Tricia Pio. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archives resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, the CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, manuscripts, periodicals, and sermons, and our digital archive, which has more than 130,000 images, many drawn from our New England Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and research fellowships for students, scholars, churches, and anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. Please do check out our website, congregationallibrary.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. Today's program focuses on New England's Hidden Histories, a longtime project of the Congregational Library and Archives that digitizes, transcribes, and provides access to early New England Congregational Church records. The CLA is commemorating the 20th anniversary of New England's Hidden Histories. And with that, please let me introduce our speakers. Tricia Pione joined the CLA in 2022 as the project director for New England's Hidden Histories. Prior to joining the CLA, she was a research scholar at Historic New England on the Recovering New England Voices project. She also previously worked as the public programs director at New Hampshire Humanities, a university lecturer teaching classes on Salem witchcraft trials and lots of other early New England topics. Her scholarship focuses on early New England, particularly the history of magic and witchcraft, and her works on these subjects have appeared in journals, blogs, books, and on radio and television. She holds a PhD in history from the University of New Hampshire with a specialization in the early modern Atlantic world and the history of science. In today's presentation, Tricia is going to go second, and I'm going to go ahead and invite up Dan Lipkin to join us. Dan is the Anne C. Pingree Director of the Phillips Library at the Peabody Essex Museum. He leads a talented staff charged with stewarding the library's extensive and varied collection and has curated or co-curated several exhibitions at PEM. Previously, Dan was Associate Museum Librarian at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He's a member of the Grolier Club, the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, and the Art Library Society of North America. He's also one of my favorite library directors in England. So I'm so glad that we were able to get you on a program today, Dan. Got to turn it over to you. Thanks for being here.
Right.
Thanks so much, Kyle, and the feeling is mutual. So I'm delighted to be here. Thanks to everybody for taking time to be here today, and big thanks to Kyle and Tricia and the Congregational Library and Archives for the invitation to participate in this component of the 20th anniversary celebration of New England's Hidden Histories, but also for their excellent and very thoughtful work in developing and maintaining the project. You know, it takes a lot of time and a lot of resources and a lot of care, and it really is admirable what they continue to do. Briefly introduce the museum, the Peabody Essex Museum and the Phillips Library, our witch trials collection, the ways in which we've gotten this material in front of people, you know, that is exhibitions, digitization, and our website. A little bit about the usage and the engagement that we've measured, and offer a couple of comments about this partnership in particular. The Peabody Essex Museum is the country's oldest continuously operating museum. We've been around since 1799, and a library has always been part of our institution in Salem. Now, the Phillips Library's collection and our reading room are housed at this facility, the James B. and Mary Lou Hawks Collection Center in Raleigh, Massachusetts. This is about 15 miles north of Salem. This 120,000 square foot building, we preserve and care for the museum's objects as well as the library collection. And this is our reading room here in that building. This is a photo from one of our September recent acquisitions open houses taken a few years ago. And keep your eyes on our calendar. We'll be having another one coming up this year, so I invite you to come up. We are open to the public by appointment on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. So I do extend to you an invitation to come and enjoy and use our collections there. The library holds more than 350,000 printed volumes and over a mile and a quarter of linear shelf miles of manuscripts and archives. So millions of pieces of paper, millions of documents. And our collections reflect all the strengths and interests that the museum has, that the library has, and more too. And you may know that today, the city of Salem attracts more than 1 million tourists a year, many of whom are seeking to learn more about the Salem witch trials. And PEM holds one of the world's most important collections of objects and architecture related to these events, and we are committed to telling the story of the witch trials in ways that honor the victims and amplify the teachings of wrongful persecution that remain relevant to today. And one example on the left there is one of the documents that we stewarded for a little over 40 years. And from 1980 to 2023, PEM's Phillips Library was the temporary repository of the state's Supreme Judicial Court collection of witch trial documents, shown here in our archival boxes as we were preparing to return them to the state. And we returned these 527 trial documents to them along with other official court documents unrelated to the witch trials. And the legal records were returned to the judicial archives following the expansion and modernization of the Massachusetts State Archives facility at Columbia Point, down by the JFK Museum and Library. And on the left here are PEM's director and CEO, Linda Hartigan, with Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, Kimberly Budd. This is at the return ceremony. On the right, the two bearded and bespectacled librarians in gray who facilitated the transfer of the documents back to their rightful home. And before we returned the documents to the state, we undertook a new round of high-resolution photography of them and made them available to researchers around the world on our website and through our catalog. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later. And I've worked on 5 witch trials exhibitions at PEM, going back to this first one that we mounted in 2020. What's interesting is that despite our collections and with the exception of a couple of displays of a few documents now and again, there hadn't been a witch trials exhibition before this since 1992. So, almost 30 years of almost ignoring the subject. This is a view of one gallery, and we built the show around the people associated with the objects that we have and incorporated documents, related trials documents for the cases and stories of those folks. The following year, Reckoning and Reclaiming featured a general introduction to the trials in the first gallery, and then it branched off into a gallery about the British designer Alexander McQueen, one of his collections that was inspired by an ancestor who was an accused and executed witch in the trials of Elizabeth Howe, and accompanied by the documents detailing the story of Elizabeth Howe's time, 1692. In the other direction, we had a gallery of portraits of contemporary practitioners of the various flavors of witchcraft. These are photographed by a Brooklyn artist, Frances Denny, who herself is descended from both Samuel Witch Trials magistrate Samuel Sewell, and on the other side of her family, an accused witch. And this exhibition also traveled to the New York Historical Society. So here we're thinking about ancestry in relationship to the Salem witch trials. The Town Sisters was a pop-up in a very small exhibition of a few documents telling the story of the Town Sisters. This was on view for a few months in the fall of 2022, and the last exhibition to feature the actual documents before we return them to the state archives. We followed that up the next year by an exhibition subtitled Restoring Justice. This was, as I think if you've been keeping track, this was the 5th exhibition in a pretty short period of time. And by this time, I think it had become clear to the museum that a more permanent solution would be wise because of the interest that these exhibitions continued to generate. This is one view. Here's another one. One of the things we did differently this time is that we used enlarged reproductions that made the documents easier to read despite the difficult penmanship. We could blast them with light. We didn't have to worry about fading ink. And we provided online transcriptions through QR codes that were linked to each document. And this exhibition really provided the template for our current and ongoing installation called the Salem Witch Trials 1692. This one had to fit in an oddly shaped triangular gallery, and this is the view as you enter that gallery. And this is the view from the other direction. And if you'll notice the document reproduction on the right-hand wall, this was actually created from one of the high-resolution photographs that we made. So it can actually blow up to a wall size. I'm not sure you'd want that in your home, but it was very effective. It's very effective, I think, in the gallery. And this exhibition is going to be on view until further notice. It remains very popular. Anytime I walk by the gallery, there's always at least 5 or 6 people in there, and people return to it every fall. This has been open for almost 2 years now. And as far as digital archives are concerned, as I mentioned before, we have a digital collection that features high-resolution photographs of the more than 500 documents that we had in our possession for over 40 years. So you can get those here. We have documentation of our exhibitions, including the panel and label texts, photography of gallery installations and interpretive materials, as well as links to other online resources for more information if you're interested. And in the past year, we've had about 14,000 page views of these digital collections, and these usage numbers tend to grow each year. So we've seen a lot of success with them. We also, in collaboration with other colleagues at PEM, the marketing department, and the website folks in particular, we created a small network of pages on the PEM website with lots of different kinds of information about the trials and the people involved in them. And these have been really, really successful. We're approaching a couple 100,000 views in less than 2 years of these pages being online. So, folks are really, really engaging them, finding them, using them. So we're delivering on that objective. And our marketing team works with an agency named Bonfire to help analyze how our online platforms are used. And I've got a couple of slides here that I thought might be interesting to you that are taken from one of their recent reports. It's really interesting, perhaps not all that surprising, to see that 85% of our traffic is coming to us on a mobile device. Now, this is a factor I think that's worth considering as we continue to support and develop the platforms that we build and maintain for sharing this content. And it's also really great to see really high engagement on these pages. Folks really are using the image sliders that we have. They're exploring more content. They're clicking links to other pages, and they're scrolling to see the entire page. I think it's pretty striking that 50% of people actually go all the way to the bottom of the page, where that's more than twice the typical number on any given page on our website. And this analysis was done, you can see Q3 2025 in the upper right corner. This analysis was done on website activity from July to September of last year, July to September 2025. And there are a couple of things worth pointing out. 2 of our top 10 pages on the website are Salem Witch Trials related. This, again, is very popular content. 44,000 views in 1 quarter, I think, is really, really excellent. And in the lower right there, you see the number 10 minutes and 38 seconds. That's the average session duration for somebody being on this page. And over 10 minutes is astronomical for this particular measurement. And it really, again, it proves that this content continues to be engaging and interesting to the general public. And, we do see repeat visits, but that number to me was really, really striking when I saw it. And finally, I think just a moment to say that institutional collaborations like the one we enjoy with the Congregational Library and Archives and with New England's Hidden Histories, these enable us to do a lot more, to reach more people than we can on our own. And having our materials accessible in more places, which is a lot easier with digital resources, of course, this helps get them in front of new and different users. And these initiatives are so valuable in building community among our institutions and across our audiences, and in advancing the shared interests that we have in very, very meaningful ways. So, I remain really grateful for the Congregational Library's early work on this initiative and the work that Kyle and Tricia and others continue to do. This project started well before my time at PEM and well before we had our own digitization program. And I'm very appreciative of and grateful for their leadership in this area and delightful to be part of the project. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you visit our website, enjoy our digital collections, come visit us in the reading room, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Tricia has to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. So many of you probably know, longtime watchers of our programs and friends of the Congregational Library, that the Congregational Library and Archives was founded in 1853. What you might not know is that our very first librarian was a man named Joseph Felt. Here he is. There he is. So the CLA has a pretty interesting history and connections with the Salem witch trials. So this is Joseph Felt. He was a congregational minister from Salem. He has connections institutionally to a lot of amazing places. He has a connection to the state library. He was appointed to organize the Massachusetts State Papers. He was the librarian at the Mass Historical Society. And then he was the CLA's very first librarian from 1854 to 1858. And his papers are actually also at the Phillips Library. So lots of connections with Felt. What I find interesting about this, and the reason why I wanted to start with Felt today, is he wrote Histories of Early New England. He wrote, you can see there, that's his Ecclesiastical History of New England, which is actually published by the CLA. He also wrote a History of Salem in a couple of editions that came out, one in 1827 and a second edition in 1845. And he was a descendant of Bridget Bishop. Bridget Bishop was the first to be tried and executed at Salem. She was executed on the 10th of June, 1692. Cotton Mather said about her that there was little occasion to prove the witchcraft, it being evident and notorious to all beholders. This is one of the documents from Bridget Bishop's trials, and Felt was a descendant of hers. So I think it's an interesting place to start with some of these. There are so many often of these family connections to the Salem witch trials because there are so many millions of descendants of people involved in the Salem witch trials. So the CLA has one of our own, but we also, through our collections, and you can see some of these on the next slide, have a lot of materials here at the library that explore some of the ways that Puritans and witchcraft have been really inextricably linked, particularly in popular culture, but in most people's understandings of early American history. When we think about Puritans, we think about witchcraft. And there are some good reasons for that. These are some New England ministers writing about witchcraft. Puritan ministers were writing very influential treatises in the 17th century. They were also often arbiters in cases of suspected witchcraft in New England. So here we've got writings by Increase Mather, Cotton Mather, and John Hale. Samuel Willard, also a congregational minister who wrote about witchcraft, not pictured here. We've also got, and you'll see on the next slide, a large collection of materials here related to Cotton Mather. This is up in our special collections in our rare book room. Many different editions of Wonders of the Invisible World, and there's Cotton Mather, and actually he's behind me there. I don't know if you can see him. That same Pelham portrait is behind me. He watches over me whenever I'm at work, which isn't creepy at all. It's totally fine. And what we have here are a really remarkable collection of Mather's works. He was such a prolific writer, but we do have a large collection of materials related to him and two other members of his family. We also established a lecture series a few years ago. Our annual Cotton Mather lecture is a way to engage in discussion about some of the new scholarship that comes out about members of the Mather family, and also the pretty complex legacy of Cotton Mather on congregationalism that continues today. We, in addition to these physical collections, these books that you can see here, we've also got a lot of material in our digital archive about Cotton Mather and Increase Mather and other members of the Mather family through partnerships with institutions like the Phillips Library, but also the American Antiquarian Society and the Massachusetts Historical Society. And on the next slide, you'll see that our collections of Mather materials also extend into the late 20th century with this 1970s comic book, which we get out quite often for tours. It's actually there's several issues. I put images from a couple of them up here. great way to talk about what popular perceptions of Cotton Mather have been, his influence on popular culture. Not historically accurate. He did not actually carry around a cross that could shoot lightning, but it's a fascinating depiction of him. Right. And then on the next slide, I've got a screenshot of our research guide and our bibliography on Cotton Mather, which is a great resource for anyone interested in probably the most famous Puritan minister of the 17th century, Cotton Mather. So it's clear from some of this material that our collections show that witchcraft continued to be a topic of interest, that it was a topic of interest from the beginning, from 1853, the origins of the library, and that it continued to be a topic of interest and actually an ongoing concern for congregational ministers through the 20th century at least. The CLA started as a minister's library, and it was an important subject for ministers to be knowledgeable about. So we have a collection of here some late 19th and early 20th century books with really beautiful bindings on witchcraft and the Salem witch trials. And then on the next slide, some pamphlets and other works from the 19th century that show that really a lot of these materials were donated to the library when they were published. So we have some beautiful first editions. And some of these pamphlets that people might not have seen before. That piece in the middle is George Lincoln Burr, famous historian from Cornell. This is a copy of something he's written, one of his books on witchcraft, took part of it. And if you can see in the top right, it's with the regard of GLB. So there's his signature. He inscribed this, and it came into the library. So we've been collecting on witchcraft in a way that is, I think, a little bit different than other institutions because it's been through this ministerial lens, which I personally find pretty fascinating. So I wanted to start here with some of our physical collections, just as a way to get us thinking about the CLA as a really interesting place to do research about witchcraft. And then I'll move us into the digital space with our Salem Witch Trials research guide. So here's what this looks like now on our beautifully newly designed website, our Salem Witch Trials research guide. So this was initially created, I think, around 2018. But we update it continuously and we'll continue to update it. It came out of a grant project where we partnered with the Phillips Library to digitize materials with funding from the Council on Library and Information Resources. And this is consistently the most popular resource on our website. Our stats don't quite compare to the PEMs, but last year in 2025, the Salem Witch Trials records page in our digital archive had 3,284 views. There it is. So we're using Cortex. And here are what some of these documents look like. So the top collection items in our digital archive over the past several years that we've been tracking it have been Sarah Good's testimony is pretty much always in the #1 spot in our most viewed items. Sarah Good's testimony, there it is right there. Beautiful. As well as Elizabeth Proctor's testimony and Elizabeth Howe's indictment. And the interesting thing when we look at some of our statistics and web traffic is that by far the top search queries that are bringing people and bringing up the CLA in search results are always related to Salem and to these documents. And so our research guide has continually been a really popular resource on our website. So I want to take us through the research guide a bit. So it starts with this overview, basically an overview of the history and some information about what's included in the guide. And so here's what we've digitized. So when you're trying to research the Salem witch trials, you'll probably notice that there have been many different resources for looking at primary sources over the years. And so what we've done here, these are just the documents. So I think there's 7 or 8 documents that were digitized through this grant project. So when you click through here, what you're going to find first are descriptions, biographical information on the people in the documents that were digitized as part of this project. So that's what each of these are. And then there's sources for that at the bottom of the page, sources for the biographical and historical context information, a little bit of a description about what's available in this project, and references to another digital archive that I'll bring up a couple times, which is the University of Virginia's Salem Witch Trials Documentary Archive and Transcription Project, which is a digital project that I've been using since I was an undergrad, which was about 25 years ago. So it's been a well-loved digital archive, and there's links to that in here as well. We've linked to that for some of these transcriptions that are available online for some of these documents. And then what I want to also highlight here is the related materials section. So if you're using this research guide, this is really what our contribution at the CLA is to the Salem Scholarship, is putting what we have to put together here, which is church records, personal papers of materials that are related to the Salem witch trials. So one of the great things about working in a digital archive and thinking in this digital space is that you can unite related collections on one page. And so that's what we've done here. So the records you see listed in this section of our research guide are church records from Cotton Mather and Increase Mather's Church, from Boston Second. You can also look at records from the Danvers Church. You can read the diary of Reverend Joseph Green, who took over after Reverend Samuel Parris. You can also look at later Salem church records, or records from other churches in what's now the city of Salem. And you can look at sermon notes from 1692, truly remarkable collections. So there's really, you could spend as much time as you wanted on this page, clicking through these links and exploring. And that's what I think is the exciting thing about this, is the way that we've connected all of these related resources and put them together in one place. This is what the bottom of the page looks like. And this is another really rich resource for any researcher who's looking for information on Salem and its legacy. So we've put together here a list of secondary sources, primary sources that are at the Congregational Library. Many of them are, because we do have a really rich collection of early Puritan works in the library, and then other online resources. And so this section, if you wanted to use the research guide, there's so much information that's compiled here. And again, you're using it probably maybe in conjunction with the University of Virginia's Salem Witch Trials Documentary Archive and Transcription Project, if you're clicking through some of the links in that materials digitized section. And when you're doing that and looking at all of this information that's compiled, you'll find that we've got some other online resources here too. So you can take a look at and easily link to the records that we have in our digital archive, the records at the Phillips library that are digitized, which include even more that are on this page. You can also look at that University of Virginia site, the Danvers Archival Center, Boston Public Library has some documents as well. And then if you wanted to, I would suggest using that resource at the bottom there, which is a way to cross-reference a lot of these. And that is through the Guide to Primary Sources of the Salem Witch Trials, which is a great cross-reference page created by Margot Burns. And our website here is something that we're continuing to expand. So as Dan mentioned, this partnership really does bring attention to these resources, and it's a great way for people who are interested, and we know there are a lot of people interested, to do this research and to look at some of these records themselves. If you want to visit, of course, the Phillips Library or visit us, you can do so. You can also find so much online these days, and we're continually working to expand this. So there will be, I'm sure, more church records that come into the library that have a connection to the Salem witch trials, and this will go on. And we're so thinking about how this works in a digital archive sense, again, it continues to expand and sort of evolve over time. So I know that not all of the documents on here are transcribed, but that's part of our transcription project. So there will be, you can keep checking back, because there will always be more and new information and materials available. So that is where I will stop for now, and we'll see some of your questions.
Well, thanks so much, Tricia and Dan. Those were fantastic presentations, really rich overviews. Is there any other period in American history that holds our fascination so much? I mean, you've just shown us, not one, but multiple digital archives, not one, but multiple exhibitions at an institution. Did the Peabody Essex do any other, did it do 5 exhibitions of any other topic in a shorter period? What is it about this period, for both of you that seems to hold our public fascination so much?
Well, I mean, doing multiple exhibitions on the same topic at a museum is almost unheard of. And so it did take, I'm glad we've got something that's a little bit more permanent, so we're not on this hamster wheel of creating more exhibitions. I mean, but I will say, I think there are unlimited opportunities for exhibitions related to the Salem witch trials. I mean, even the comics that Tricia just showed, I mean, that's like a perfect example of a different direction you could take it. So I think there is still a lot of work and creative work and creative approaches to interpret interpreting the trials left to do. I think it's partially because I think the fascination is partially because we can't really know all the truth. So there's a certain amount of mystery that is still there. Like, the documents are the closest thing we have to the documented facts. No photographs, no TikToks, no, New York Times app from back then. And so some of it will remain unknown and is subject to conjecture. But I think it's just in part, it's just a fascinating episode of injustice and misunderstanding. And it happens at the basically before the birth of this country and had a significant influence on how some of the institutions that we enjoy today, the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, help to get established. So that's a part of it too.
You think, Rachel?
Well, and I would say too that I think part of the reason why it continues to be fascinating is because it continues to be in the public consciousness for a variety of reasons. Partly because people continue to make movies and TV shows where Salem is referenced, and that always brings it into the consciousness, I think, of new generations. But also think about the ongoing work of memorialization. It was really only a couple of years ago that the new memorial at Proctor's Ledge in Salem opened. It was just, I think, 2022 or 2023 that they dedicated a part of Interstate 495 to Susanna Martin, who was one of the women executed during the Salem witch trials. So that ongoing work of, the way that the trials have been represented in public memory and how we think about them, but that memorialization work too, like that's ongoing efforts to, overturn convictions and exonerate people continues in all over New England, actually, in New Hampshire and Connecticut as well. And so I think that's part of what keeps it in the public consciousness.
The questions are rolling in, but I want to pick up on something you just said, Tricia. Is the digital archive and these exhibitions, is it memorialization? Is there an advocacy element to the work there, or is it just the facts? I don't know if I'm framing that properly, but is this part of our own making recompense, I guess? And I don't know.
It's a really interesting question. I want to think about it more, and I will. But I would say right off the bat, sometimes the way I sort of started by framing this, thinking about the Congregational Library as an institution engaged in this work, because the Congregational Library is, in a way, a descendant of these early Puritan ministers, right? Cotton Mather right behind me. And so I think in a way, it is important memory work for us to be doing as the Congregational Library. But I would also say that I feel like making these documents available is a way to support other people who are doing, thinking about memorialization and thinking about the kind of work that's happening on a judicial or legislative level. And of course, I don't think that museums or archives are neutral. So I suppose in a way it is advocacy in the sense that we are continuing to keep these documents available and keeping them, and continuing to do programming work on it. That is a really great question to think about, though. I don't know. Dan, what do you think about that?
It is an interesting question. I do think we are contributing to that memorialization. We are contributing to the restoration of justice, and that's one of the points that we make in our current exhibition and the one immediately preceding is that it took a very long time for the Salem community to actually build a memorial, 300 years, right? And like I can't even imagine what it must have been like in 1695 or 1702 to walk down the street and cross paths with somebody who might have been on the other side, or somebody who had accused one of your family members, or somebody you yourself had accused. It just seems kind of unimaginable. And I think part of what I think our role is as a museum and library in this whole thing is to play that kind of factual historical role in the Salem community, in the sense that a lot of Salem is about the tourism and the fun of Halloween and buying a witch hat and walking down the street and coming into town for Halloween and doing all of that celebratory stuff. Whereas what I think we really have a role to play in communicating the facts of the story and helping to memorialize the events and the people involved in that way, and being true to the real history of what.
So there's Kelly Thompson writes, I'm a digitization librarian and a descendant of Marytown Eastie. Thank you for this presentation. You brought up, and I think Kelly sharing this, there is a large community of descendants. And I wonder if you'd both talk about, are they an audience that is kept in mind in doing this kind of work?
Yes. I mean, I think to some extent we are doing this work for descendants, right? In the same way that we're doing this work for our local communities and for the broader public at large. You know, we do think, at least in my work, I've thought quite a lot about even how we spell somebody's name. And we've gotten a lot of feedback on how we've made those decisions, and what we've decided, what spelling of Howe, of Elizabeth Howe's last name we might have decided, or the last name of Mary Eastie. And we do hear from people when they either agree or disagree with our decisions. And I think it's an important part of the dialogue to keep open. So yeah, I think descendants certainly play a role, and we get communicated, descendants communicate with us quite often. And I should also say that the Salem Witch Museum does offer what they call descendant packets if you're just starting on genealogical research of your own ancestor, that we often refer folks to the Salem Witch Museum for those resources too.
And I think I would add to this too that, one of the things that is interesting for us as historians and thinking about this history is the question of whose ancestors get this much attention. And when we think about restorative justice and people who've been executed for other crimes, alleged and real in Massachusetts, that simply have not received the same level of attention from institutions, but also from the public. And I think it's always interesting to think about descendants in that respect too. Who else was falsely accused? What other injustices have there been in, we're coming up on the 400th anniversary of the city of Boston in 4 more years, right? So thinking about these histories and these really long legacies in Massachusetts and whose ancestors, sort of the way that we prioritize and where we focus our attention.
On that thread, John Putnam asked if you have any suggestions for accessing Putnam family history as it relates to the Salem witch trials. John was with us with our program last week and learned that the Samuel Parris papers exist somewhere. Are they digitized?
So Samuel Parris's sermons, it's the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. As far as Putnam specifically, I don't know if we have. I can't think of anything that we have at the library or in our research guide specifically on the Putnam family.
And we do have collections of Putnam family papers, mostly later, we're talking 18th century to 19th century, but we do have a significant collection of Putnam related material, both primary source and secondary source material.
Great question. And I think there's so many different families to connect with. And I think it speaks to looking online, but talking to the librarians, right? And talking to the project directors at the CLA, at PEM. They have a wealth of information. I know there are things that we have in our collection that are not always very easily found by just using our online library catalog. Another aspect, which you both sort of touched on, a question from an anonymous attendee. I see that some collections are noted as having transcriptions available. Are you actively trying to get all of the collections transcribed related to the witch trials?
Yes, transcribe it all. We're gonna we are always looking for volunteers for our transcription project here at the Congregational Library for New England City Histories. This is going to help tremendously, not just because it's hard to read 17th century handwriting, but also because that's just probably a vanishing skill, reading cursive, not just reading 17th century handwriting specifically. So we're always looking for volunteers. And yes, we would love to have everything transcribed eventually.
And I'll add that if you are interested in transcriptions of Salem witch trials related documents, that the volume edited by Bernard Rosenthal that came out in 2009 is kind of the Bible of transcriptions. There are almost 1,000 documents retranscribed by 10 or a dozen scholars. It took 10 years. It's all indexed. There are great glossaries and lists of names in the back. and wonderful introductory essays to that volume. I mean, it's, this thick, so you can certainly, it can double as a paperweight, but that's certainly worth searching out, and it's not very expensive. And that's what I've relied on as kind of the authoritative transcriptions of these documents in my work.
Yeah, I second that.
I will put into the email that goes out to everybody who registered a link to that. You can, of course, find it in both of our library's collections. But you
In
can
my house.
it's still in print, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, there's a paperback edition that came out.
Lauren McDonough says, thanks so much for sharing. Great presentation. What are you excited to include in your digital archives that isn't currently there?
It's a fun one to think about because I'm sure there are still documents out there waiting to be found. And I think it's entirely possible that we'll have some new primary sources.
I'd love to have some of the documents that are housed at other repositories that probably should be with the Massachusetts State Judicial Archives, like at New York Public and Boston Public. I'd love to have those rephotographed and included online. I think there are a couple held down south as well, but it'd be nice to have fresh new photography of those things that I know are floating around out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of great things that were microfilmed and then the microfilm was digitized, and it would be great to have everything reshot. Yeah.
And it sounds like that's a commitment, both of your libraries, to go to the original source to photograph rather than just photographing from the microfilm. Is that just about because the quality is better, or is there a reason to go back to the original?
I mean, I think it is about better quality, but it's also about having a sense of getting a better sense of color and the color of ink as well as the color of the paper, and how much, you can really tell kind of how much conservation might have been done on a given document. There are things that you can tell, like artifactually, by looking at it in color and in high resolution, that you can't from a microfilm copy, which is just going to be essentially a black and white photocopy.
The question I love in here, which follows up from an anonymous attendee, asks, is it possible there are still documents out there to be found about the Salem witch trials that we don't know about? 300 plus years later.
I mean, who knows? I think it's unlikely, but you never know. Somebody just found a really valuable copy of the Declaration of Independence slipped behind a painting in a frame up in New Hampshire not long ago. I mean, it's not impossible. We certainly have boxes and boxes of archival materials that haven't really been looked through. It'd be great if we could find some more warrants for execution. There's only one or two of those known. I'd love to have more documents about the locations and transfers of prisoners at the time, just to try to learn how people got moved around between Ipswich and Salem and Boston, and Andover, but maybe they are out there.
There's also the material that we suspect was destroyed at some point, right, historically, and it would be amazing if we found more references to that material, or if somehow it wasn't destroyed or burned.
Yeah. And there are fakes out there too, so that's always a concern.
Let's not create any more fakes.
No.
Our friend in the Southwest, Anna Swingerin, asks, where would you recommend somebody coming to your collections for the first time to start? I mean, you've actually given us a lot of resources here. Where's a good starting point for somebody who wants to start to understand the Salem experience?
I mean, I would point them to our collection page on the PEM website as just a good overview of what happened, who was involved, what are some of the common questions that people ask, and then go from there. If you have questions or needs that are more specific or targeted, I mean, feel free to give us a call or contact us at the library. I'm sure you all feel the same way at the Congregational. We're happy to help you navigate what questions you do have. But as Tricia said in her talk, and as we've already said, there's a ton of stuff out there. So there's a lot you could learn and look at.
So there's a very thought-provoking question here from our friend Reiner Smolinski, a great scholar of Mather in the 17th century. And so I'm curious your response to this. He says, the availability of online resources and publications is a tremendous boon to researchers and the public at large. But by the same token, doesn't this distort our modern views and that we are being provided with insights that were not, say, available to the Oyers and Terminers as well as the ministers at the time. So are our views, in a way, skewed by this sort of totality of sources? A really fascinating way of kind of thinking about it. And I know, Tricia, you've been a classroom teacher, and Dan, I'm sure you've led more than your share of educational tours and programs. What do you do with that question?
I love that question. That's a great question because I think about, we can reconstruct what people involved in the trials had to read. We know what Cotton Mather's library looked like. We know the books that he recommended people read, and we have many of those books that were recommended here, copies of them. But yeah, so that idea of, again, I think maybe what Reiner might be getting at is that perhaps this availability does give us a false sense of superiority in our knowledge and kinds of the ways that we would inform our decisions today. And I think that is a really interesting thing to ponder. So even though we can recreate and know what people were reading at the time, and the worldview that they may have constructed out of those sources of information, I can see that as a very modern concern, this idea that, with access to all the information we have, I guess we could also think about the difference between information and knowledge too, right? That's always a question for libraries and archives to think about. That's a great thing to ponder. I don't
And
know.
even the mere fact that these folks thought witches were real, right? And we say today, like these people were accused witches. They were not witches. Even that different way of perceiving the world, I think, you know, I'm not sure how you reconcile that, except to say, well, these people were accused witches and they weren't, and they were, this was a severe injustice. But that belief in the supernatural then was a factor.
And as you think about this, I'm looking at our attendee list right now, and when I scroll down to the M's, I see Margot Burns, Marilyn Roach, and Mary Beth Norton, fantastic historians.
Yeah.
If we're thinking about this, should we actually start with the history first before going into the primary source? Does it make a difference in the direction we come at it?
I like maybe an overview first, a brief overview, and then the primary sources, a sprinkling, and then I would dive into the deeper context of scholarship if I was doing a class. I think sometimes you can use the primary sources as a great way to grab attention and to bring students in when they get to read those words. But that also gets us back to that question of, thinking about our modern views and our insights that Reiner asked. I think I would recommend to anyone who's really interested in the Salem witch trials to read as broadly as possible in the 17th century and to read books that may not also just be about witchcraft, and to really get a good sense to understand what that invisible world could have looked like for people and what their reality was.
Breaking news comes from Margot Burns. Margot writes, recently, the deposition of Timothy Swan against Anne Foster was found in the Suffolk Files at Mass Archives. So, keep that question. So, all of you go out into the archives and find the things that have maybe been hiding in plain sight or maybe waiting for us to rediscover. I think that's wonderful.
And that's a great
I
tip.
hope it continues. Yeah. Yeah.
To find those.
So we have an educator on here, John Smith, who says he regularly teaches a course on the Salem witch trials, and his students always end up having a favorite figure from that event. So do you have a favorite, somebody you most enjoy reading about and investigating, or just who captures your interest or imagination?
Well, I mean, Mary Eastie wrote one of the most powerful documents, and so I tend to fall back on her just because her plea to the magistrates in September was really, really heartfelt and beautifully written and very moving. So that's where I go first.
Well, Samuel Sewell is right outside my office here at the Congregational Library. He's in the cemetery right out there. And his diary is a great source. He gives us a lot of information about his life and his thoughts. Of course, I find Cotton Mather endlessly fascinating. Again, I love prolific authors and I appreciate having a lot of source material. Yeah, I think, it's hard to have a favorite. I don't think I could have a favorite. But I would say the talking cats are always a highlight for me. So many of the testimonies involve cats talking to people. So I think actually they're the most underrated stars of the Salem witch trials are the talking cats.
Eh.
Mm.
Now you're making me think of Sabrina the Teenage Witch.
That's where they got it.
So there are several people in here who have asked, "Hey, I'd like to volunteer to transcribe these documents. What do I need to do?"
Send us an email to NEHH@beacon.org and we'll connect you with our wonderful transcription director, Helen Gelinas, and she will get you started on transcribing.
And for anything and everything related to the library, you can contact research at PEM.org and be happy to have you involved.
Fantastic. Reach out early and often. Trisha, Dan, thank you so much, not only for the presentation you gave today, but the work you're doing, right? I mean, it's really essential work to making these materials accessible. And you have my thanks from the bottom of my heart for the work that you're doing. So take care,
Very
everyone.
much.
We'll see you at our next program.